Greetings! In this video, I would like to subject the Gospel account of Jesus' trial and conviction to a historical and legal analysis, and try to understand what offenses were attributed to Jesus, and why the punishment was so severe. The trial of Jesus is reported by many sources, among which, naturally, the four canonical Gospels are the most important. The Gospels of Mark and Matthew mention two trials, one before the Sanhedrin and one before Pontius Pilate, while Luke adds a third trial before the Tetrarch Herod Antipas. The accounts of the three evangelists are quite brief, and all three clearly drew from a single source, possibly an oral tradition that had developed by the time the Gospels were written, or an earlier narrative. The account in the Gospel of John differs sharply from the others. It provides many important details that explain some of the unclear moments found in the Synoptic Gospels. Despite the fact that the Gospel of John is the latest, I tend to consider it the most reliable. John dictated his gospel in the 90s of the first century, towards the end of his life, but it is unlikely we can doubt that its author was an eyewitness to the events, one of Jesus' apostles. While Mark, Luke, and likely also Matthew were not eyewitnesses and relied on information they had heard from others. To conclude the discussion of the Gospels, I will mention that the account of Jesus' trial can also be found in the apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus. This narrative is located in the first part of the Gospel, titled Acts of Pilate. This account mostly repeats John's version, but since the Gospel of Nicodemus dates from a much later period, it is best to leave it without for consideration. So, I begin the account of the Gospel events, constructed based on the texts of the four Gospels. After Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, the guards took him through the Zion gate into the city, and brought him to the house of the former high priest Annas, located near the gate. Annas was high priest from 7 to 15 A.D., and after his dismissal, he became a member of the Sanhedrin. It should be noted that he maintained influence in the Sanhedrin, and was, in a sense, its gray cardinal. The Sanhedrin included 5 of his sons, and his son-in-law Caiaphas was the high priest at that time. Apparently, he decided to meet with Jesus first before he appeared before the Sanhedrin. Annas likely wanted to bring the case to a point where Jesus could be accused of leading a secret community. Therefore, as John reports, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. With a calm, brief, and precise answer, Christ thwarted the plan of the retired high priest. "I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in a synagogue or in the temple, where all the Jews come together, and not said any of it in secret." Jesus then pointed out to Annas that, for the trial, what was objectively important was not so much the opinion of the accused, but the testimony of the witnesses. "Why ask me? Ask the ones who have heard what I spoke to them. You see, they know what things I said." Jesus defended himself very skillfully, and the accusation of organizing a secret society did not resurface either at the Sanhedrin trial or in the other proceedings. After the interrogation, Annas sent Jesus to the palace of the high priest Joseph Caiaphas, who, as I already mentioned, was the head of the Sanhedrin. At that moment, the Sanhedrin had already gathered in one of the halls of the palace. So, what accusations did the Sanhedrin bring against Jesus? As one would expect from a religious court, he was accused of crimes against religion. The first accusation was the violation of the sacred Sabbath. It is known that Jesus healed on the Sabbath, and, according to the Talmud, medical practice on this day was prohibited, except in cases where the patient was in danger of death without the help of a doctor. You might say that the Talmud was written much later than these events, but I think you would agree that its rules were based on ancient traditions. For example, in the book of Numbers, there is an account where Moses commanded that a man who gathered firewood on the Sabbath be stoned to death. However, the accusations of Sabbath breaking were weak and were not presented at the Sanhedrin trial. Earlier in Galilee, Jesus was accused of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul, meaning he was accused of sorcery. This crime was punishable by death, but Jesus successfully rejected these accusations at the time, so this accusation was also not brought up at the Sanhedrin trial. Two accusations were brought before the Sanhedrin. The first, an attempt to undermine the sanctity of the Jerusalem temple. His figurative words, "I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another." 2 witnesses were even found who testified that he had indeed said this. But Mark mysteriously noted, "But not even in this way was their testimony the same." This remark can only be understood as meaning that the judges failed to apply the law fully. Jesus' statements did not constitute a call or intent to destroy the temple. The only accusation that reached a logical conclusion was the accusation of blasphemy, that is, that Jesus called himself the Son of God. The accusation almost fell apart, as the Sanhedrin could not find witnesses who clearly and unequivocally testified that Jesus had blasphemed. The term Son of God could be interpreted too broadly, for example, as child of God, which could mean any of the believers. Therefore, the high priest interrogating Jesus had no choice but to accept his own confession as the decisive evidence. In the Gospel of Matthew, the high priest's question is as follows: "I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God." In Mark it reads, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Let me clarify. Blessed is one of the names for God. Jesus responded, "Thou hast said, Nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, and coming in the clouds of heaven." In other words, Jesus not only confirmed that he was the Messiah, but also provided the appropriate Old Testament reference. Hearing this response, the high priest considered it blasphemy, and in mourning tore his clothes. After this, the members of the Sanhedrin unanimously pronounced the death sentence on Jesus. It is evident that the verdict was reached a priori, before the trial even began, and Caiaphas quite openly stated the reasons for this decision. It is better for us that one man should die for the people rather than the whole nation perish. The Jewish authorities feared that Jesus' preaching would cause unrest among the people, which in turn would lead to the harshest measures from the rulers of the empire, who were concerned with maintaining peace and order in the province under their control. Caiaphas's reasoning is simple. Even if there is no direct evidence, a reason must be found to eliminate the Galilean before we all become hostages to his ambitions. But only half of the job had been done. It was necessary to ensure that the sentence was approved by the Roman prefect. And therefore, in the morning, after the overnight trial, Jesus was taken to trial before the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate. But why could this not be bypassed? The fact is that after Judea came under Roman rule, the powers of the Sanhedrin were limited. Criminal jurisdiction was taken away from it, leaving only jurisdiction over religious offenses, for which the Sanhedrin still had the right to issue death sentences. However, these sentences had to be reviewed and approved by the Roman governor. The execution of sentences was also the responsibility of the Romans. After Judea was annexed to Rome as a province in 7 A.D., these duties were entrusted to the prefect of Judea. From 26 to 36 A.D., the prefect of Judea was Pontius Pilate. A bit about him. From the very beginning, his relationship with the Jerusalem elite did not go well. He openly disliked both the Jews and the Jewish elite, and he constantly clashed with them. Josephus Flavius listed the numerous offenses committed by the prefect against the Jews. For example, when Pilate first entered Jerusalem, he did not remove from his soldiers' standards figures and images that were completely unacceptable to the Jews, since Judaism prohibited any representations. The result was unrest. A similar outcome occurred when Pilate used funds from the temple treasury to pay for the construction of an aqueduct that supplied clean water to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The next unrest began after Pilate hung golden shields dedicated to Emperor Tiberius in the temple. While the first incident with the images could be somewhat explained by Pilate's ignorance of Jewish customs, the second was pure malice, intended to provoke the Jews even more. It's not surprising that the Jews inundated Rome with numerous complaints and denunciations of Pilate's actions. During his time as procurator, Pilate spent most of his time in Caesarea Maritima, a Hellenized city mostly populated by non-Jews, and only came to Jerusalem when absolutely necessary. At the time of the trial, he happened to be in Jerusalem for the Passover festival. After covering the relatively short distance between Caiaphas's courtyard and the governor's palace, the excited crowd brought the prisoner to the praetorium. Pilate came out to the gates of the fortress, and he says, "This man, you are bringing what kind of charge against him?" The members of the Sanhedrin knew perfectly well that Pilate would not approve a death sentence for blasphemy under any circumstances. The Romans were not interested in the subtleties of Jewish doctrine, and incidents like this were not regarded as crimes under Roman law. So, they gave an evasive answer. If he were not doing wrong, we would not have brought him over to you. Pilate responded, "You take him, and you judge him according to your law." The Jews replied, "For us it is not lawful to execute anyone." Luke reports that the Jews next accused Jesus of forbidding the paying of taxes to Caesar. This was a blatant lie, because there were many witnesses to the episode when in Galilee, when asked, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we give or should we not give?" Jesus asked them to show him a denarius, and said, "Bring me a denarius, that I may see it." So they brought one, and he said to them, "Whose image and inscription is this?" And they said to him, "Caesar's." And Jesus answered and said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." The leaders of the Sanhedrin finally brought forward an accusation that hit the mark. They accused Jesus of proclaiming himself the Messiah, or Christ in Greek. The Messiah, according to Jewish doctrine, is the Anointed One, a descendant of King David, sent by God to deliver the people of Israel and restore their independence. The deliverance of Israel would bring about the correction of the entire world. In other words, by declaring himself the Messiah, Jesus proclaimed himself the King of Israel. The King of Israel, as is well known, was considered to be the Roman emperor, and this could practically be seen as an attempt on the emperor's power. Thus, Jesus was charged with the most serious of all possible political offenses, offense against the majesty of the Roman people. The law on insulting the majesty had been adopted during the Republican era, but was widely used during the imperial period. It was the reigning emperor Tiberius who significantly expanded its scope. The law punished treason, other crimes against the state, and most importantly, any attempt on the emperor's power. This crime was punishable by confiscation of property and death. For Roman citizens, it was decapitation, and for non-citizens, it was scourging and crucifixion. Moreover, the crime for which someone was crucified had to be briefly indicated on the cross. This was a very serious accusation, and it is no wonder that Pilate began the judicial inquiry with it. He immediately asked, "Art thou the King of the Jews?" And he answered him and said, "Thou sayest it," meaning he agreed with the accusation. And then, as Luke reports, Pilate supposedly said to the members of the Sanhedrin, "I find no fault in this man." What can we say about this statement? Only the sacramental phrase, "This cannot be," because it can never be. Everything falls into place after we look at John's account. According to his version, Jesus defended himself very skillfully. He asked Pilate, "From yourself are you saying this, or have others spoken to you about me?" In other words, Jesus essentially offered the prefect a choice. If Pilate is using this term in the sense that a Roman would naturally use the word, then he is not the King of the Jews. But if this refers to the Jewish teachings, that is, if it concerns the words of the Jewish prophets about a king, in the sense of the hopes of the entire world, then Jesus was ready to give further explanations. Pilate hastily replied, as a Roman would, "Am I a Jew? It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What have you done?" And then came Jesus' brilliant defense. "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have fought so that I not be handed over to the Jews. But in fact, my kingship is not from here." Agree that after these clarifications, Pilate's decision to acquit Jesus seems far less implausible. During the judicial investigation, Pilate learned that Jesus was from Galilee, and taking advantage of this, he decided to rid himself of such a tricky case. Galilee was not part of Judea, and a trial of Galileans did not fall under the jurisdiction of the prefect. This region was part of the tetrarchy of Herod Antipas. At this point, I must digress for a moment and explain the role of Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was one of the sons of Herod the Great. After his death in 4 BC, Augustus divided Herod's kingdom among his sons, and, as you can see on the map, Herod Antipas was given Galilee and Perea. He ruled as tetrarch from 4 BC to 39 AD. Herod Antipas is widely known for ordering the execution of John the Baptist for his sermons condemning the sinful relationship between Antipas and his brother's wife and niece, Herodias. Antipas was in Jerusalem on the occasion of the Passover, and Pilate sent Jesus to him. Only Luke reports on the trial before Antipas. He wrote, "When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased, because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. He had heard about him and hoped to see him perform a miracle. He questioned him at length, but Jesus gave him no answer. Then Herod, with his soldiers, ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in a light robe, he sent him back to Pilate. The outcome of the process was inevitable. Antipas was happy to talk to Jesus, earnestly asking him to perform a miracle, but he had no desire to get involved in Jewish disputes or become a victim of numerous denunciations. After Jesus was returned to Pilate, the members of the Sanhedrin began to threaten him with denunciations. If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone calling himself a king is opposing Caesar. Pilate, clearly losing his resolve, confirmed the sentence of the Sanhedrin. He must have imagined what might be written in such a denunciation, and how his enemies could present the actions of a Roman official who had acquitted a criminal charged with such a grave offense. The subsequent fate of Pilate convinces us that his fears were not without basis. In the year 36 A.D., after another denunciation, Pilate was recalled to Rome. This might not have been particularly significant, but in 37 A.D., a new emperor came to power in Rome, Caligula, who viewed with great distrust the officials appointed by his predecessor Tiberius, and sent Pilate into exile, to Vienna. According to legend, Pilate committed suicide there. I have little doubt that the emperor resorted to the common punishment in Rome for disgraced officials, sending Pilate an order to commit suicide. There was only one last chance for Jesus' salvation. On the occasion of Passover, by tradition, the governor would release one prisoner of the people's choice. There were two candidates, Jesus and a certain Barabbas, convicted of murder. I will say right away, Jesus had no chance of being freed. Barabbas was not just a murderer, he was a Sicarius, a dagger man, a member of a group of people who sought to overthrow Roman rule. The Sicaria, armed with weapons, would attack Roman officials and soldiers, as well as local residents who collaborated with the Romans. All the tensions between the Romans and the Jews, which I mentioned earlier, had their consequences. In Jewish society, opposition to Roman rule was rapidly growing. As a result, the Sicarii enjoyed significant support from the local population. Jesus had many followers in Galilee, but in Jerusalem, only a very few knew about him. He arrived in the city a week before his execution, and according to the Synoptic Gospels, this was the first time. It was clear that, under any circumstances, the crowd would choose Barabbas. Pilate's efforts were of no help here, as he, of course, desired the death of Rome's enemy, Barabbas. It is well known that, in accordance with the charges brought against Jesus, he was subjected to scourging and, since he was not a Roman citizen, was sentenced to crucifixion. According to the law, a plaque was nailed to the cross with a brief description of his crime. It was written in Greek, Aramaic, and Latin. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. In the past, representatives of the mythological school denied the historicity of Jesus. But now, with the discovery of numerous artifacts, the existence of Jesus, the trial against him, and his execution are no longer questioned. What happened next, whether Jesus Christ was resurrected or not, is a question not for historical science, but for faith. As a believer, I, of course, believe in the resurrection, because, as the Apostle Paul wrote in his first letter to the Corinthians, "If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, your faith is in vain." Goodbye.